Okay, everybody, here we are ready to start the period 5 and 6 review of the modern era. This is in the blue packet that you have, and I've got this broken into 4 parts. The first section will be on industrialization. Then we will move on to imperialism and state formation. Then the revolutionary period along with nationalism and reform. And then finally global migration. So that's the plan for this. So I'm going to get started. So as I said, our first section is on industrialization and global integration. So I'm just going to go through the packet with you. On a couple of these slides, I'm going to ask you to stop the video and do what I'm asking you to do there, just for some practice on that. And then just to practice. So on this one, industrialization fundamentally changed how goods are produced. And it leads to a whole lot of things, actually a whole lot of things led to that. And this is here some context. If we were to get a DBQ on industrialization, this would be some of the context you would use for it. Europe's location on the Atlantic Ocean, access to the trade routes, geographic distribution of coal, iron, and timber. Places like Great Britain and Germany and Northern Europe had a lot of this. Urbanization, the growth of cities, improved agricultural productivity, the mechanization of agriculture, which allowed for much more efficient agricultural productivity, which created the workforce for the factory system. Legal protection of private property. You couldn't lose the state just couldn't take over your factory. Whole lot of canals and rivers, so water transport, access to foreign resources, and then the accumulation of capital, things that make money. So look at the reasons above and think of what maybe the most important ones are here and write a thesis statement. Okay, stop the video and do that. Okay, next up, some factors involved in this. Okay, the steam engine. Probably the most important invention of that period, certainly of the industrial period, and creates really this modern industrialization. There probably is no industrialization without the steam engine. And it's because power then begins to come from machines and not human or animal sources. And the steam engine allows factories to can be built anywhere. You no longer have to be located directly near water or something else to do it. And this whole system really allows us to produce more goods, and those goods are cheaper. They're less expensive. Internal combustion engine is an improvement on the steam engine. First of all, it increases energy availability. It is a more powerful engine. Usually they're smaller and more compact than these large steam engines. They run on oil usually, which provides more energy per pound, making it more portable, and this leads you to be able to have the automobile. Can you imagine having to drive around with enough coal to take you on a trip? Coal is way heavier. You probably have to carry a trailer full of coal. Think about the old locomotives with the locomotive in front, and then they had the next car was where they kept all the coal for the trip. Benefits of this: vast new resources of energy that you can generate so much more power, allowing for greater productions of goods, also more mobility, more trade, more wealth. So a lot of upside, but also some downside. Pollution is probably the number one of all these, and then all the problems that come with it. And then you could get into all the drawbacks of industrialization with the poverty and the poor working conditions and all the other stuff that came off of that. Okay. So just kind of the next thing is the development of how this came about. Okay, you develop the factory system based on the steam engine. This allows you to concentrate labor in a single location instead of having your labor and pieces of it spread out all over the place, and it really increases the degree of what is called specialization of labor. People are trained to do a specific job, and they do that job, and they do it to the exclusion of anything else. You don't have what we might call a generalist anymore in this situation. Okay, new methods of production will eventually spread around northwestern Europe and all the rest of Europe, eventually to the United States, to Russia and Japan, as we've studied, and this will eventually culminate in World War II. This will be the thing that grows out of this, and a lot of it is it's a main cause of it, and we don't think about it that much. Is that industrialization provides great wealth, But because of that, it also produced competition between nations for resources. They want each other's stuff. And it also, the use of industrial production to mass produce weapons and other military uses of the industrialization of warfare, and it leads to the catastrophic destruction of property and people. Okay. In addition to the new methods of steel production, which came out of the Industrial Revolution and are all part of that, and it's a major piece of it, you had steel production in the first Industrial Revolution, but then the second round that comes in more towards the end of the 19th century, you begin to produce other industrial goods, chemicals. Factories begin to be run on electricity. And the energy is produced off-site, not with a power plant in the factory, and the growth of more precision machinery allowing you to make finer stuff. The steel process itself is improved during this process by what's called the Bessemer process. Okay, and it improves it by first creating the first inexpensive process for mass production of steel. So not only could you produce more steel, that steel is of higher quality also. Okay, so we've got another kind of flow chart here. Rise of factories and urban centers create the need for raw materials and food supplies, growth of export economies. This is the genesis of imperialism, which we're going to talk about in the next video. Okay, export economies are very closely tied to the industrialized countries that they supplied resources and food for. The money made from exporting raw materials was then used to buy the finished goods produced by the industrialist country. It's a vicious cycle. This is that an improvement, or maybe not an improvement, on the triangle trade of the slave trade. Okay, vicious cycle. Next up, the main industrial resources of the Industrial Revolution. Where did they come from? Okay, cotton comes predominantly from the American South, from Egypt, and from India. Rubber, can you imagine, not having rubber for tires and things like that? And it's a vital cog. It's produced around a lot of places around the world, though in some places it's not an indigenous crop. The Amazon is one of the places it's most indigenous to, and also Southeast Asia. But it was also produced in Central America, in Brazil in the Amazon, West Africa in the Congo rainforest, in India, Southeast Asia, and the East Indies. Rubber trees grow in rainforests, so you've got to have a rainforest for it really to be able to work. Sugar, a major topic of the previous units, grown predominantly in the Caribbean and Brazil, but also in Ecuador, Australia, and a little bit in the East Indies, what is modern-day East Indies. Guano, this is bat crap, basically. So next time somebody says you're full of bat crap, or you tell them you think they're bat crap crazy or something like that, you can tell them it's guano. And that they had built. This came from the Galapagos Islands. Guano was predominantly used as fertilizer, and they dug out these big ships of. And loaded them with the stuff and steamed it off to Europe to use as fertilizer. And it was not just bad guano, but it was also the birds that nested on the Galapagos Islands, and they had these huge resources of it. South America becomes a major meat producing, and still is, Argentinian beef. Anybody who's ever been to the Texas de Brazil there over in Destiny, that's really grows out of the Argentinian style of how you serve meat. And then diamonds come predominantly from South Africa, though there are some other places in Africa that produce them, and also in India. Okay, another flow chart, okay, showing how one thing affects another. A lot of cause and effect here during the Industrial Revolution. Some ideas to keep in mind if we were to get an Industrial Revolution. DBQ, rapid development of steam-powered industrial production. Okay, that's the kind of the first thing. This increases European and U.S. manufacturing power because they're the first adopters, and it will lead to a decline in Middle Eastern, Ottoman Empire, Asian countries, predominantly China, their manufacturing power. So as the global economy of the 19th century expands dramatically from the previous period due to increased exchanges of raw materials and finished goods in most part of the world, such commodities gave merchants and companies based in Europe and in the U.S. a distinct economic advantage. And a lot of it's because, first of all, the building blocks of coal and iron are much more abundant in those areas than elsewhere, but also they're the early adopters of these processes. Okay, Going back to China, and this kind of we'll get into a little bit more when we get into the imperialism time, but this was kind of how the British pried open the China trade. And they did it by using opium. And what they basically did was they hooked the Chinese on opium, which creates a demand for British opium that comes from, as you can see on the map, predominantly from the areas of north of India, Afghanistan, and areas like that were all controlled by Britain. And to pay for that opium, the Chinese paid with silk, tea, and porcelain. We'll get into the next video and talk about the fallout from that. All right. Other products that were transferred around the world that you saw on the map on the previous page. Whoops. Previous page. Okay. Cotton, copper, palm oil. Okay. Copper mines were in Chile, but also in Mexico. Some of them were used for wealth because they did become coinage, but copper was also vital in industrial production. Palm oil is used in industrial production and became a major export from Africa to the European countries. And cotton, grown in South Asia and Egypt and also in the United States, fed the cotton mills of England and New England, especially for United States cotton. Okay, this leads to a change in economic systems. Okay, Western countries begin abandoning mercantilism, adopting free trade policies, partly in response to the growing acceptance of Adam Smith's theories of laissez-faire capitalism and free markets. Okay, so we've got here some information on Smith. He wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. The basic ideas he lays out is that the government, first of all, does not interfere in the economy, and that the economy is ruled by what he calls the invisible hand. And it's basically, as people push to create more for themselves, others benefit from that. The idea that I saw was, you have the local butcher, the guy who cuts meat. He doesn't just do that because, in some cases he does like to cut meat, but he does it to make money. It's not out of the goodness of his soul that he provides meat to people to buy. It's more because he wants to make money off doing it, and he's good at it. And so people benefit by having fresh meat in their area. Okay, so the key beliefs of Smith: laissez-faire, the idea of supply and demand ruling economic decisions. Businesses will not supply something unless people want it. The idea of a division of labor, spreading it over multiple places. And then the big idea of free trade. Okay, the global nature of trade and production contributes out of this capitalism to the proliferation of large-scale transnational businesses that relied on new practices in banking and finance. One of the most famous of these early companies, and these are the companies that come after the East India companies, the state-run monopolies, and one of the most famous is the United Fruit Company, which you would probably better know as Chiquita Banana. Okay. Other major manufacturer of this is a company called Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, known today as HSBC, which is a major banking corporation. I believe they are now owned by KeyBank, but they still have branches elsewhere around the planet. Okay. Stock markets. In this whole time, you've heard a ton about the stock markets in our coronavirus situation. Okay, stock markets are simply a collection of markets and exchanges where regular activities of buying and selling and issuance of shares in publicly traded companies takes place. It really helps to determine the value of corporations. And then something that doesn't come up that much anymore is called the gold standard. Okay, and this is when a country ties the value of its currency to the amount of gold it possesses. In theory, anyone possessing a country's paper money could present it to the government and receive an agreed upon amount of gold from the country's reserves. The U.S. is no longer on the gold standard. We were until 1973. We went off it because it's very inflationary, because as the price of gold goes up and down, it messes with the value of your currency. Okay, gold standard. Technologies that come out of industrialization, the railroads, allows for transport of heavier goods and people faster and more efficiently than by road and water. And the lines can be more direct, and it runs on steam. Steamships allow for water-based travel to become quicker with the use of the steam engine. Telegraphs, they're kind of the forerunner to the telephone and now the modern day internet, allowing for faster communication of information over greater distances. And canals often shorten the distance people traveled and goods traveled, thus decreasing time lost and expensive trade. You can see the major canal there, the Suez Canal in the picture on the bottom right, cutting off the trip around Africa by cutting through the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea by digging a canal to connect the two, known as the Suez Canal. All right, capitalism. Economic system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners rather than the state. It results in some reform movements, and we'll get into these a little bit more in the third video, but two of the major ones are the early ones, the idea of utopian socialism put forth by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. And it's usually thought of to be kind of like an idealistic or futuristic society based on some kind of positive ideals moving society forward. Okay, anarchism is another philosophy that becomes kind of popular early on in the Industrial Revolution, and it's this idea that you're going to get rid of the state and reject any kind of coercive or involuntary hierarchy. And some examples of this showing up in the French Revolution, later in the Russian Revolution, and much of the writings of Marx deal with this idea. Okay. Getting down to the end here. In Qing China and Ottoman Empire, some members of the government resisted economic change and attempted to maintain pre-industrial forms of economic production, while other members of the Qing and Ottoman governments led reforms in imperial policies. And in each government, there were two separate reforms, and I'm going to pull up a little sheet here to look at for that. As soon as it opens, okay. In the Ottoman Empire, it's the Tanzimat reforms. You're going to want to pause the video and review this. I also gave you this form when we were studying those, so it should be in your notes. And in China, it was the self-strengthening reform that Heimler mentioned on the video. The idea was they were really about introducing a lot of the Western ideas, but sadly, in each case, there was a big pushback from traditionalists who didn't like this idea, and it leads to defeat for both empires. Okay, so going back to those two, so make sure you review those topics. All right, so some other reform movements that take place, and again, we'll spend a little bit more time on these a little later on. You have the economic reforms of Meiji Japan. The idea was to westernize Japan after the arrival of American ships and kind of forcing Japan to trade. And they adopted a lot of Western-based reforms. A unique one was the development of the cotton textile industry in Egypt. And basically this was done by the Ottoman Pasha, an Egyptian named Muhammad Ali. And what he basically did was he set up this system where all goods had to be sold to the state. And then they expanded agriculture, improved irrigation, and used coerced peasant labor to grow cotton, and it has a huge impact on developing wealth in Egypt. Okay, so both of these are pretty successful examples where Tanzimat and self-strengthening were not. Okay, some governments mitigate the negative effects, and there's several things, and we know a lot about the child labor laws. One of the ones that you may not know about is that Germany in 1889 actually put in an old age and disability insurance that provided pensions for workers over 65 and for those who were permanently disabled. It took the United States until 1939 to do this with Social Security, and that's basically what Social Security is. And there's still a lot of people that would like to get rid of Social Security in this country, even though to me it just makes the most sense in the world. All right, getting down to the end here. People organize themselves into society. That goes through a whole thing. There's new social classes, middle class and industrial working class develop. This changes family dynamics, gender roles, and demographics. Okay, you go from living on the farm, where everything is structured around the farm and everybody is working together, to working in cities, in factories, where everybody leaves the house to go work. And this changes family structure. It because first of all, you don't have as many children, because children aren't as useful as workers, as you see from the demographic thing, as they were in the farms. So people have less children, and you also get away from what's called the extended family, where people, it's mostly just parents and children, no longer the grandparents and aunts and uncles like you had in the old agrarian days. The gender roles stay the same in agricultural societies, but in the industrial society it changes because everybody's working, except for the middle class women. When middle class women are expected to stay at home and not work outside the home, and be focused slowly on child rearing. While it gives them the power of creating the next generation, it does diminish a lot of their political power, because everything is based on economics. And then finally, the demographic change, the decline in the birth rate, because children, you don't need as many to work on the farm, so you don't have as many. It also becomes more difficult to support these large families, and the larger percentage of the people live in the cities. Okay. Last thing is just a kind of recap. The rapid urbanization leads to a variety of challenges: pollution, poverty, increased crime, public health crises, housing shortages, and insufficient infrastructure. Make sure you've got at least 3 of these that you can talk about. So just make a list of the 3 that you think are the most important, and the effects of each. All right, the next video will be on imperialism and the growth